Hi and welcome to the lesson maybe about the most advanced usage of stateful processing, which is the complex event processing. So the complex event processing, CEP in abbreviation, is a kind of a pattern detection. So like you can apply regular expressions on top of your strings or text in your applications. Here you can do approximately the same thing, but on top of incoming events. And of course, if you want to apply some patterns on multiple events that may happen in the past, well, you will need a stateful processing to keep these past events somewhere in state store in occurrence. So the architecture is just at a first glance, it's similar to simple streaming processing, right? Because you have one source, but when you try to combine different sources, it becomes much more complex, but still it's quite possible to do with event processing. But later you have something we call a rules engine that contains all the specification for the patterns you want to detect, and there are outbound actions that are plugged to this rule engine, and they can be different type. They can send a notification, they can materialize the pattern in a database and stuff like that. And in this specific concept, so here about these streaming sources and this data address source, we talk about an event cloud because there are multiple events that are combined in a single process and interpreted by the rules engine and emitted as an actions whenever there is something found. And there are four main requirements for this CEP. And the first one is the abstraction level. So here we cannot assume that we will process a single event source. We will always combine different sources, meaning possibly multiple streaming sources and eventually some data address stores to make this whole event cloud much more smarter. The second part is about the business driven. So typically here you are really focused on the business use cases. Of course, you can implement CEP for some technical use cases also when you want maybe some error detection mechanism on for your servers, but it's very often driven. The needs here are very often driven by the business users and much more rarely by your technical colleagues. Whereas for simple streaming processing, you will have both maybe implied at the same time or with the same effort with the same application. And the third requirement is that you need to process data in low latency, but you will need to process high volume of data probably, meaning that you will of course need to be able to scale and to adapt your pipeline to the incoming records. And the main building block for CEP is pattern. So here we have an excerpt of CEP module of Apache Flink when we define the beginning of the pattern of event type, where we try to find the event time or event name of first visit in the beginning. Later in the middle, so after that, we are trying to find this sub-event type, so something that is really specific to the visit, like for example pricing. And later we want it to be followed by the last visit event. In that case, we can consider it as a whole pattern, but inside you will find 3 individual patterns and one pattern sequence that combines all these individual patterns into a single meaningful for the business perspective pattern. So there are different classifications for the patterns. First one is that the pattern can be required or optional. Second one, it can be a singleton, so you need only to find one element, or a looping pattern, so one or more elements. And another example, so the looping pattern is a customer adding some items to his or her basket, because the customer can add multiple items to the basket, not necessarily at the same time. The singleton pattern is when the customer leaves the payment page without paying, even though depends how you build your pattern, but if you want to stop your pattern when the customer leaves the page without paying, of course, it will be the singleton pattern. But if you want to detect multiple events for the same user when he or she leaves the payment page without paying, this singleton pattern transforms automatically to the looping pattern. So there is always this nuance. How do you define it and in what kind of scope? So now there is also different conditions. We can have a simple conditions, which is a kind of filter expression you saw previously. So namely whether the item has a discount, the item that has been added, and the iterative conditions that relies on the past element, so on the state that is already available. For example, in the same category, you may be asking whether how many items seen so far or added to the basket so far have a discount. And there is a much more precise example without any API. So we want to detect risky orders, and in this case we have simple condition and singleton patterns. The pattern to define the basket summary page as a start event for the CEP pattern, and later we have the iterative condition and looping pattern for this if case when we want to know the number of visited pages so far and whether the order is classified as risky or not. So all this is quite new, right? Because this is quite specific. I repeated the pattern word a lot in this lesson. I'm aware of that, and I'm aware that this repetition can make the lesson not very understandable or not very easy to understand. But believe me that I will give you a much more precise example with the code, and it should be much more clear afterwards. So thanks for watching, and see you in the next lesson where we will see the CEP in action.